Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 45 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Vegas Golden Knights, in which the Sharks have lost 3-2 in a shootout. So, technically, the Sharks' losing streak now extended to a full 6 games, even though they did technically get a point here tonight. And as the previous couple of games did go, the Sharks scored the first goal once more. They, in fact, actually have the only goal of the first period and hold a 1-0 lead after 20 minutes against the Golden Knights. And early in the second, just a few seconds into it, Noah Gregor adds one to that to make it 2-0. So Knyzhov and Gregor, two players who don't normally score much for the Sharks, get a decent lead for them. However, the Golden Knights would very soon after respond with a Mark Stone goal to make it 2-1, and then after chipping away at the San Jose Sharks, getting a lot of good chances for them, they would eventually get the game-tying goal from Mark Stone, and we would eventually head into an overtime, though not without some chances before that. The Sharks had a few decent ones in the last few minutes, but none came closer than the Golden Knights in the dying seconds of the third period even. This is a shot from William Karlsson that actually beats Martin Jones, but as it's about to bounce into the net, Mario Ferraro manages to clear it from the goal line to keep the Sharks alive and to get them the single point in this one. And Jones says thank you to Mario Ferraro, and in a return puts up an outstanding overtime. The Sharks were completely lifeless in the overtime. They had one decent chance from Timo Meier, but otherwise, whenever they would even get a rush up the ice in the overtime, they would completely blow it. They had a 3-on-1 in this overtime, and then Karlsson just fans a bit on his pass, and it was just kind of a disaster, and the Golden Knights got chance after chance. Mark Stone himself had more chances in the overtime than the entire San Jose Sharks team, with 2 or 3 really good ones that Martin Jones was able to rob him on. But we would eventually head to the shootout, where we would normally see for the Sharks a combination of Donato, LeBanc, and Couture as the first 3 shooters. However, here tonight, because of a relatively special night, it can be said definitely as just a small record being broken by Patrick Marleau. He is the first shooter for the San Jose Sharks, and he pulls off a classic Marleau move, goes for the 5-hole onto Robin Lehner, and it is saved. However, he doesn't do any worse than any of the other Shark shooters in the shootout. Both Donato and Couture also end up getting saved by Lehner, and the Golden Knights only need 1 goal to win it in the shootout. And as I say, the Sharks drop their 6th straight. First thing to talk about, I guess, the playoffs, because while the Sharks did lose here tonight, their single point was enough to actually get them some ground in the standings. The only other team in the playoff race here tonight that was in action was the Arizona Coyotes. They faced off against the Minnesota Wild and lost in regulation. So instead of being 5 points back of the Coyotes, the Sharks now find themselves just 4 points back of the Coyotes with a game in hand still. However, the Coyotes don't necessarily seem to be the team to watch in this regard. It is probably the St. Louis Blues, who the Sharks now trail by 3 points, yet the Blues have 2 games in hand on them. So it'll be interesting to see how the Blues look, as their schedule is still extremely difficult down the stretch. Next, I'll be talking about Martin Jones. He actually gets the start here tonight, which I wasn't necessarily surprised about, but it also, as I said in my previous review, would not have surprised me to see Koshinash get the start, and it seems as though Jones delivers with a very nice one here tonight. Didn't have much of a chance on the Mark Stone first goal, which was a tip. The second one was technically one he could have had, but also definitely still a tough one, and otherwise Martin Jones was a big reason why the Sharks even managed to get a single point out of this game. If I'm being completely honest, the Sharks were mostly outskated in this one. The first period was not too bad. It was a bit back and forth. But after that, the Sharks kind of just fell in the hole. And in the end, you look at this one, you see Martin Jones making a ton of great saves, and you see the 2 goals for the San Jose Sharks were kind of lucky in a way. Knyzhov, a seeing eye shot from the point that Lehner probably could have had. Gregor's one was also one Lehner probably should have had. And so the Sharks, they get a couple goals here. They get the point here, but Martin Jones was definitely a big reason why they managed to get all of that, and so he was a very big piece. The Sharks will have another game coming up on Wednesday, still against these Golden Knights, and I'd be very surprised to see him not still in the net. Next, I'll be talking about Noah Gregor, a player who I have a few times this season actually praised at least somewhat. You know, he's not a game breaker for the San Jose Sharks, but I've always been kind of disappointed when Bob Booners decided to take him out of the lineup because I felt as though Noah Gregor was one of the more consistent fourth-line forwards, especially when you compare it to some of the other players that the Sharks have been icing recently. And because the Sharks are looking for some sort of spark, Booners is looking for some sort of spark, he decides to make a pretty aggressive line change. We're going on the first line with Kane and Couture was Noah Gregor, and in the end he actually managed to score a goal in that role. You know, he wasn't putting up crazy good shifts with the San Jose Sharks. This wasn't some sort of first line that I expect to stick for any foreseeable future, but the fact that he still managed to score a goal was nice to see. It was a very important goal in this one, considering it was a game that ended up going into regulation. So hopefully with this goal, not that he retains the first line spot, but that he actually retains a relatively consistent lineup spot, because I also thought, and this is probably another reason for why he ended up being promoted to that first line here tonight, I also thought Gregor looked pretty good in the previous game against the Minnesota Wild. A couple of really nice chances for him to score in that one that he just barely missed on, so nice to see him get rewarded here tonight. And finally, I will talk about Timo Meier. You know, I must say, I've actually given this a great deal of thought, and I don't think there is any player on the San Jose Sharks this season who has been more disappointing than Timo Meier. You know, I look at Kane, who's actually looked quite good. Couture, not so great as of late, but was really good start. You know, LeBanc, I wasn't necessarily expecting a ton from, so he's been pretty decent in that first line role. Both Burns and Karlsson, you could definitely say compete for this role, but Brent Burns, you know, I wasn't necessarily expecting a world beater performance from him. Erik Karlsson, at the very least, while I was expecting a nice rebound season from him, and that hasn't necessarily happened, at the very least we have seen some really great games out of Erik Karlsson. When it comes to Timo Meier, there just really hasn't been much of anything this season. Even when he has gotten his points, it hasn't really been in games where I've said, wow, Timo Meier really looking good, really taking over the game. It's just sort of been like, oh, he gets an assist here, oh, he gets a goal there. And so it's just been kind of a weak effort night in, night out from Timo Meier, and he actually was called out by Bob Booner in the previous game. Apparently, Booner says that LeBanc and Timo Meier both had horrible first periods in that one. With Kevin LeBanc, I was kind of surprised to hear that, because I don't think LeBanc's first period that game was particularly bad, and honestly I don't even think Meier's was so bad that it deserved to be called out compared to every other player's first period and every other player's other periods this season. However, when I think about it, Meier is definitely a player that deserved to be called out at the very least, not necessarily for that first period performance, but just in general, because as I said, he's just been so disappointing. And it's crazy to think how much he has fallen off from 2 years ago, where he was such a seemingly a big difference maker for the San Jose Sharks in that 18-19 season. And a lot of people have said, oh, well, you know, that was just a season where the Sharks were insane offensively and Meier benefited from that. But you cannot tell me that you watched those games that the Sharks played in the 18-19 season and Meier was just benefiting from an offensively gifted Sharks team. No, Meier seemed to be a completely different player a couple of years ago. And I've also seen some pretty cynical takes as well, that Meier was just looking to get paid, get a good contract, and then he's just going to take a few years off. But even when you look at cynical takes like that, it's usually when it comes to, you know, unrestricted free agents who are, let's say, 30, 31 years old getting 8-year deals. Like, if you wanted to make a cynical take like that about Marc-Edouard Vlasic after he got his deal for that 8-year contract, then you would at the very least have some sort of point, because by the end of the deal for Marc-Edouard Vlasic, he probably wasn't going to get much of a contract anyway. But Meier only ended up signing for 4 years, and if he had actually managed to sustain the performance that he had in the 18-19 season, and maybe even improve on it, he could have been in line for a massive raise that could have saw him making $8 to $9+ million for at least 7 or 8 years for the San Jose Sharks. But instead, if we're getting this type of performance from Timo Meier, and this continues over the last 2 seasons of his contract, he's going to get a significant discount on his next deal, which is just kind of insane to think, because so many people, when he signed that first contract, that $6 million contract, people thought that was the steal of, the offseason that year, because his underlying stats were so fantastic, which just makes his downfall here even more surprising. So there seem to be so many parts of Meyer's game that were working just 2 years ago, and now suddenly 2 years into the future, in the middle of what is supposed to be his prime, right? Most people say that an NHL player's prime years are between their age of 24 to 26. Meyer is right there in the middle of that, and yet it's been very disappointing throughout the vast majority of this season. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Wednesday, where they will take on the Golden Knights once more. It was a shootout loss here tonight, so in the end, the Sharks now 0-6 against the Golden Knights on the season, and they have 2 more games remaining in the year. Can they manage to beat the Golden Knights at least once? I guess we'll find out by the end of this week. Class dismissed.